Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Today, I'll share some early findings from the work that we do in CROSSEU on the relationship between extreme weather events and income inequality. Extreme weather events are not just meteorological anomalies. They are socioeconomic stress tests that reveal and often exacerbate underlying weaknesses in our systems. They challenge not only our physical infrastructure, but our social infrastructure as well. And one of the most consistent patterns we observe again and again is that lower income individuals and communities are affected disproportionately. This not only undermines well-being and livelihoods, but also weakens societal resilience. Understanding the distributional effects of extreme weather events and climate shocks, therefore, is critical for designing effective and equitable adaptation policies. It also speaks directly to the goals of DAFNI, enabling data-driven, evidence-based, and socially informed infrastructure and resilience planning across the UK and abroad. Let me briefly introduce CROSSEU. The acronym stands for Cross-Sectoral Framework for Socioeconomic Resilience to Climate Change and Extreme Events in Europe. It is a Horizon Europe EU-funded and UKRI co-funded project that brings together universities, research centers, and stakeholders from across Europe. In practice, CROSSEU achieves two things. First, we quantify the economic and distributional impacts of extreme weather events and climate change, from infrastructure damage and crop losses to knock-on effects such as income inequality, gender inequality, migration pressures, and health impacts. Second, it builds practical tools, including a dynamic DSS that empowers long-term planning for EU and national policymakers. The work in CROSSEU is organized across six work packages, four of which are scientific. WP1 focuses on the global macroeconomic and econometric modeling. WP2 hosts our case studies. WP3 delivers the DSS system. And WP4 develops our governance and policy recommendations based on the results that we find in our models. Together, these elements ensure that CROSSEU is not just an academic exercise. It is a policy-facing framework designed to strengthen resilience under uncertainty. In this slide, I'd just like to briefly introduce you to our case studies. And we use case studies to ground our work in real-world challenges and opportunities, to make sure that the work that we do in CROSSEU is not just theoretical, but applied. These case studies are not peripheral to our project, they are central. They act as real-world laboratories for testing our hypotheses, validating our models, and engaging directly with stakeholders through a process of co-creation, co-development, and co-validation. These eight case studies that you see here span a diverse mix of geographies, hazards, sectors, and socioeconomic contexts. Before I move on to the main part of my talk, which is the technical modeling of the relationship between income inequality and extreme weather events, allow me to spend a minute in introducing the TIL platform, an interactive dashboard we are using in CROSSEU. This dashboard allows policymakers and researchers to explore climate projections such as temperature, precipitation, extreme events, alongside socioeconomic datasets and variables and results. Indicators like population, food security, energy demand, and infrastructure vulnerability. The key point is accessibility. TIL is designed to make complex science intuitive and visual, bridging the gap between data and decision-making. It enables users to move from abstract climate projections to concrete, place-based insights that can directly inform resilience planning. I'd now like to turn to the technical part of the talk, the econometric analysis that we do in WP1 and CROSSEU, modeling the impact of extreme weather on inequality. At its core, we ask a simple but very important question. Who is most affected when climate extremes happen? And how does this shape long-term and economic outcomes? When disasters strike, it is not well-insured professionals in climate-controlled offices who bear the brunt. It is low-wage and informal workers, people in secure housing, and households with limited savings, limited insurance, and no access to emergency support. For them, shocks translate into job losses, disrupted schooling, lost harvests, displacement, and rising debts. Short-term losses that cascade into long-term disadvantage. Our modeling shows this clearly. Most worrying is the feedback loop. As inequality rises, social cohesion weakens, adaptive capacity erodes, and inequality becomes entrenched. This cycle fuels poverty, displacement, and political instability, while undermining productivity and imposing mounting fiscal costs to governments and taxpayers. Inequality is not only a consequence of climate change and climate extremes, it is a multiplier, amplifying societal impacts and undermining societal resilience. In this chart, which I borrow from the European Environment Agency, we see economic damages, economic losses from extreme weather events across the EU in the last 40 years, adjusted to today's prices. 3 points stand out. First, the variability is striking. Some years exceed 50 to 60 billion euros in damages, often linked to floods, heat waves, or compounded events like heat waves followed by wildfires. Second, the composition has shifted. Storms once dominated, but in recent years, floods and heat-related hazards have risen sharply. Third, the little blue line that you see on the right part of the chart, the long-term trend, is pointing up. Average annual losses have doubled since the 1980s and continue to rise. From a policy perspective, the message is sobering. Each billion euros lost could often have been at least partially avoided through better design, smarter infrastructure, or early warning systems. Instead, the cost falls on taxpayers, insurers, businesses, and most painfully on vulnerable households. In the next chart is drawn actually from US data, but it's relevant globally. And what we see here, we see how heat exposure above 30 degrees affects mental health across income groups and across genders. The blue bars on the left show that the poorest individuals report the most severe impacts, while higher income groups are less affected. The red bars highlight gender differences. Women consistently report greater mental health impacts than men, reflecting caregiving roles, employment patterns, and access to support. The key message here is that climate risk is not only physical, it's socially and economically patterned. Exposure may be similar, but consequences vary depending on who you are, where you live, and what resources you can draw upon. In CROSSEU, we take this seriously. Our modeling, particularly in WP1 and WP2, goes beyond averages and aggregate variables to quantify how burdens fall across income and gender groups. Our goal is to provide tools that capture these distributive outcomes and help inform policies that are fair as well as effective. So what exactly do we do in terms of the econometric estimation of these effects? In econometric terms, we run a set of fixed effects panel regression with interaction terms that allow us to test this hypothesis. The objective of our work is to estimate how different types of extreme weather events affect income inequality. To do that, we draw on 3 broad different types of data. First, climate data and climate indicators. These come from ERA 5 reanalysis data, which provide consistent, high-resolution indicators of extreme weather events across decades and regions. Second, we use harmonized income data drawn from the World Bank's Poverty and Inequality platform, as well as the standardized World Income Inequality database. And third, we integrate with these datasets a broad range of macroeconomic and institutional indicators, variables like GDP per capita, employment structure, sectoral exposure, governance, and access to credit. This allows us to examine how vulnerability and recovery capacity vary, testing, for example, whether stronger social protection reduces regressivity, or reliance on agriculture amplifies drought impacts. Let me very briefly introduce you to our climate indicators for extreme weather events. This is an ongoing work, it's not finished work, so the list keeps expanding. But so far, we use 5 types of extreme weather events in our analysis. First, hot days above 35 degrees. Second, heat waves, then cold waves, icing days, and heavy precipitation days. For each of these events, we compute 2 dimensions, intensity and frequency. Intensity reflects how extreme a given event is, relative to long-run historical conditions. Frequency tells us how often these events occur. But we also wanted a single synthetic variable that combines these 2 aspects into one representative indicator for each type of climate shock. For this, we apply principal component analysis, a dimensionality reduction technique that extracts the dominant pattern of variability from the data without assuming prior weights. Next, let me just very briefly introduce our economic and institutional variables. First, we use sectoral GDPs. We focus on 3 sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. This allows us to gauge which parts of the economy are most exposed to climate shocks. Agriculture is typically more sensitive to heat and drought, while services may be less affected from these events. We also include household consumption per capita to capture living standards that GDP can miss, especially in economies with large informal sectors, such as India, for example. To reduce dimensionality, we compute a principal component of sectoral GDP, yielding a single composite indicator of shared growth dynamics. Beyond output and consumption, we account for structural factors, for instance, unemployment as a labor market indicator, or domestic credit to the private sector as a measure of access to finance and recovery capacity. We also use the share of working-age population to capture demographic pressures, and also female labor force participation to highlight gender vulnerabilities. We also include the polarization index following the methodology of Esteban and Trey. This index measures the extent to which society is divided into internally cohesive but mutually distant groups. It is a useful proxy for latent conflict potential or group-based inequality, which can amplify the social consequences of climate stressors. Other variables that we include are trade openness as well as quality of governance, which is built from 6 World Bank dimensions: control of corruption, government effectiveness, political stability, rule of law, regulatory quality, and voice and accountability. Using PCA, we reduce the 6 dimensions into a single variable, which explains over 87% of the variance in the governance dataset. This helps us capture institutional capacity and resilience, critical factors in both adaptation and recovery. I will now very briefly introduce 3 of our specifications. We have more than 10 of our specifications in this stream of models, but I will only touch on 3 of them. Starting with equation 1, specification 1, our baseline model. On the dependent variable on the left-hand side is the log of average income for each income decile. On the right-hand side, we include a vector of the climate shocks I mentioned previously: heat waves, cold waves, icing days, hot days, and heavy precipitation. We also add sector-specific GDP for each one of the 3 sectors that we examine: agriculture, industry, or services, to examine how different economic structure conditions affect vulnerability. Then we take a broad set of controls, the ones that I mentioned previously, to capture business cycle effects, demographics, and all the other impacts that I mentioned previously. Finally, we include country and year-fixed effects to account for unobserved heterogeneity. Specification 2 is very similar to specification 1, but in this one, we replace sectoral GDP with household consumption per capita, a demand-side measure of welfare that better captures informal activity, which is often missed in GDP. Specification 3 uses a principal component of sectoral GDPs, reducing agriculture, industry, and services into one composite indicator of overall economic performance. I apologize about the small size of the fonts, but you can see my slides online. This slide shows the full distribution regression for the agricultural sector. Each column is an income decile. Column 1 is the bottom, the poorest decile, the bottom 10%. Column 10 is the top 10%, the wealthiest one. Starting with the extreme weather events, with the climate variables, we see that heat waves and hot days consistently depress incomes, and the effects are strongest in the lowest deciles. For the poorest households, incomes fall by around 1.5% to 2% with each unit increase in these indices, and the negative impact remains statistically significant across most of the distribution. Cold waves and icing days also show negative coefficients, though their effects are smaller and less consistent. The control variables largely perform as expected. Unemployment reduces incomes across the board. Again, the poorer households feel it more. Polarization is strongly negative, especially for poorer households, reinforcing the idea that inequality and fragmentation make communities less resilient. By contrast, access to credit and good governance are positively associated with incomes in most deciles, showing that financial inclusion and institutional quality can help buffer shocks. The next table extends the model to the other two sectors, industry and services. Starting with industry, the top panel, we see again a clear pattern. All extremes, all four extreme weather events, have negative effects across the distribution, again with poorer deciles the hardest hit. Turning to services, which are shown in the lower panel, we find again a similar picture. Heat waves, and cold days all depress incomes across the distribution. Once again, the regressive pattern persists. Poorer households are the most affected. The third table includes heavy precipitation. Again, the same regressions are run, and again, the same result is found. Across all three sectors, the coefficient of heavy precipitation is negative and statistically significant, although relatively smaller in magnitude when compared to temperature extremes. And finally, the last set of results that I'm going to show takes subsets of our data sets and examines these subsets by restricting the countries to climate zones. So we distinguish between arid, tropical, and tropical temperate climate zones. And again, the same pattern is found. Starting with the agricultural sector, we observe that hot days significantly reduce income for the bottom 8 deciles. In the industrial sector, the pattern again is consistent. Hot days again have a negative effect and significant impact across all deciles, with particularly strong effects in the lower half of the distribution. Finally, for the services sector, we again see statistically significant negative impacts for hot days, especially in the lower and middle deciles. In short, these results reinforce our earlier findings, but place them in the context of climate-sensitive geographies. These zones are more exposed to high temperatures, and their economic structure amplifies income sensitivity. This has important implications for both climate adaptation and economic diversification policies. This analysis provides early evidence that climate extremes consistently exacerbate income inequality. All of the climate shocks we examined show regressive effects, with the poorest consistently suffering more. Among these, heat waves and cold waves display the most persistent and statistically significant inequality effects across all sectors and deciles. Even heavy rainfall, though weaker in effect, is still statistically significant and negative in most cases. We also find that interaction effects are strongest at the lower end of the income distribution, meaning that climate effects are not only unequal, but they amplify existing inequalities. Finally, these inequality effects are not uniform across climate zones. Their magnitude and direction vary between tropical, arid, and temperate regions, with important implications for the spatial targeting of policy. Together, these results underscore a central point. Distributive justice must be integrated into climate impact modeling and into policy design. If left unaddressed, climate extremes risk entrenching inequality, both within and across countries. Embedding climate justice frameworks into climate strategies is therefore not optional. It is essential. Thank you.